You cannot avoid the interplay of politics within an orthodox religion. This power struggle permeates the training, educating, and disciplining of the orthodox community. Because of this pressure, the leaders of such a community inevitably must face the ultimate internal question: to succumb to complete opportunism as the price of maintaining their rule, or risk sacrificing themselves for the sake of the orthodox ethic. From Muad'Dib, The Religious Issues, by the Princess Irulan. Paul waited on the sand outside the gigantic maker's line of approach. I must not wait like a smuggler, impatient and jittering, he reminded himself. I must be part of the desert. The thing was only minutes away now, filling the morning with the friction hissing of its passage. Its great teeth within the cavern circle of its mouth spread like some enormous flower. The spice odor from it dominated the air. Paul's stillsuit rode easily on his body, and he was only distantly aware of his nose plugs, the breathing mask. Stilgar's teaching, the painstaking hours on the sand, overshadowed all else. How far outside the Maker's radius must you stand in pea sand? Stilgar had asked him, and he had answered correctly, 1/2 a metre for every metre of the Maker's diameter. Why? To avoid the vortex of its passage and still have time to run in and mount it. You've ridden the little ones bred for the seed and the water of life, Stilgar had said. Brought your someone for your test is a wild maker, an old man of the desert. You must have proper respect for such a one. Now the thumper's deep drumming blended with the hiss of the approaching worm. Paul breathed deeply, smelling mineral bitterness even through his filters. The wild maker, the old man of the desert, loomed almost on him. Its cresting front segments for a sand wave that would sweep across his knees. Come up, you lovely monster, he thought. Up. You hear me calling. Come up. Come up. The wave lifted his feet. Surface dust swept across him. He steadied himself, his world dominated by the passage of that sand-clouded, curving wall, that segmented cliff, the ring lines sharply defined in it. Paul lifted his hooks, sighted along them, leaned in. He felt them bite and pull. He leaped upward, planted his feet against that wall, leaning out against the clinging barbs. This was the true instant of the testing. If he had planted the hooks correctly, at the leading edge of a ring segment, opening the segment, the worm would not roll down and crush him. The worm slowed. It glided across the thumper, silencing it. Slowly it began to roll, up, bringing those irritant barbs as high as possible, away from the sand that threatened the soft inner lapping of its ring segment. Paul found himself riding up right atop the worm. He felt exultant, like an emperor surveying his world. He suppressed a sudden urge to cavort there, to turn the worm, to show off his mastery of this creature. Suddenly he understood why Stilgar had warned him once about brash young men who danced and played with these monsters, doing handstands on their backs, removing both hooks and replanting them before the worm could spill them. Leaving one hook in place, Paul released the other and planted it lower down the side. When the second hook was firm and tested, he brought down the first one, thus worked his way down the side. The maker rolled, and as it rolled, it turned, coming around the sweep of flower sand where the others waited. Paul saw them come up, using their hooks to climb, but avoiding the sensitive ring edges until they were on top. They rode at last in a triple line behind him, steadied against their hooks. Stilgar moved up through the ranks, checked the positioning of Paul's hooks, glanced up at Paul's smiling face. You did it, eh? Stilgar asked, raising his voice above the hiss of their passage. That's what you think? You did it? He straightened. Now I tell you, that was a very sloppy job. We have 12-year-olds who do better. There was drum sand to your left where you waited. You could not retreat there if the worm turned that way. The smile slipped from Paul's face. I saw all the drum sand. Then why did you not signal for one of us to take up position secondary to you? It was a thing you could do even in the test. Paul swallowed, faced into the wind of their passage. You think it bad of me to say this now, Stilgar said. It is my duty. I think of your worth to the troop. If you had stumbled into that drum sand, the Maker would have turned toward you. In spite of a surge of anger, Paul knew that Stilgar spoke the truth. It took a long minute and the full effort of the training he had received from his mother for Paul to recapture a feeling of calm. I apologize, he said. It will not happen again. In a tight position, always leave yourself a secondary. Someone to take the Maker if you cannot, Stilgar said. Remember that we work together. That way, we're certain. We work together, eh? He slapped Paul's shoulder. We work together, Paul agreed. Now, Stilgar said, and his voice was harsh. Show me you know how to handle a Maker. Which side are we on? Paul glanced down at the scaled ring surface on which they stood, noted the character and size of the scales, the way they grew larger off to his right, smaller to his left. Every worm he knew moved characteristically with one side up more frequently. As it grew older, the characteristic upside became an almost constant thing. Bottom scales grew larger, heavier, smoother. Top scales could be told by size alone on a big worm. Shifting his hooks, Paul moves to the left. He motioned flankers down to open segments along the side and keep the worm on a straight course as it rolled. When he had it turned, he motioned 2 steersmen out of the line and into positions ahead. "Ak, hi-yo!" he shouted in the traditional call. The left side steersman opened a ring segment there. In a majestic circle, the maker turned to protect its opened segment. Full around it came, and when it was headed back to the south, Paul shouted, "Geralt!" The steersman released his hook. The maker lined out in a straight course. Stilgar said, "Very good, Paul Muad'Dib. With plenty of practice, you may yet become a sand rider." Paul frowned, thinking, was I not first up? From behind him there came sudden laughter. The troops began chanting, flinging his name against the sky. "Muad'Dib, Muad'Dib, Muad'Dib, Muad'Dib." And far to the rear along the worm surface, Paul heard the beat of the goaders pounding the tail segments. The worm began picking up speed. Their robes flapped in the wind. The abrasive sound of their passage increased. Paul looked back through the troop, found Chani's face among them. He looked to her as he spoke to Stilgar. "Then I am a sand rider, still?" "Hal-Yorm, you are a sand rider this day. But I may choose our destination, that's the way of it. And I am a Fremen born this day here in the Habanya Erg. I have had no life before this day. I was as a child until this day." "Not quite a child," Stilgar said. He fastened a corner of his hood where the wind was whipping it. "But there was a cork sealing off my world, and that cork has been pulled. There is no cork. I would go south, Stilgar, 20 thumpers. I would see this land we make, this land that I've only seen through the eyes of others. And I would see my son and my family," he thought. "I need time now to consider the future that is a past within my mind. The turmoil comes, and if I'm not where I can unravel it, the thing will run wild." Stilgar looked at him with a steady, measuring gaze. Paul kept his attention on Chani, seeing the interest quicken in her face, noting also the excitement his words had kindled in the troop. "The men are eager to raid with you in the Harkonnen sinks," Stilgar said. "The sinks are only a thumper away." "The Fedaykin have raided with me," Paul said. "They'll raid with me again until no Harkonnen breathes Saracen air." Stilgar studied him as they rode, and Paul realized the man was seeing this moment through the memory of how he had risen to command of the Tabor Sietch and to leadership of the Council of Leaders now that Liet Kynes was dead. He has heard the reports of unrest among the young Fremen, Paul thought. "Do you wish a gathering of the leaders?" Stilgar asked. Eyes blazed among the young men of the troop. They swayed as they rode, and they watched, and Paul saw the look of unrest in Chani's glance, the way she looked from Stilgar, who was her uncle, to Paul Muad'Dib, who was her mate. "You cannot guess what I want," Paul said, and he thought, "I cannot back down. I must hold control over these people." "You are Mudir of the Sand Ride this day," Stilgar said. Cold formality rang in his voice. "How do you use this power?" "We need time to relax, time for cool reflection," Paul thought. "We shall go south," Paul said. "Even if I say we shall return back to the north when this day is over, we shall go south," Paul repeated. A sense of inevitable dignity enfolded Stilgar as he pulled his robe tightly around him. "There will be a gathering," he said. "I will send the messages." He thinks I will call him out, Paul thought, and he knows he cannot stand against me. Paul faced south, feeling the wind against his exposed cheeks, thinking of the necessities that went into his decisions. They did not know how it is, he thought, but he knew he could not let any consideration deflect him. He had to remain on the central line of the time storm he could see in the future. There would come an instant when it could be unravelled, but only if he were where he could cut the central knot of it. "I will not call him out if it can be helped," he thought, "if there's another way to prevent the jihad." "We'll camp for the evening meal and prayer at Cave of Birds beneath Hibanya Ridge," Stilgar said. He steadied himself with one hook against the swaying of the maker, gestured ahead at a low rock barrier rising out of the desert. Paul studied the cliff, the great streaks of rock crossing it like waves. No green, no blossom softened the rigid horizon. Beyond it stretched away to the southern desert, a course of at least 10 days and nights, as fast as they could go to the makers. 20 thumpers. The way led far beyond the Harkonnen patrols. He knew how it would be. The dreams had shown him. One day, as they went, there'd be a faint change of colour on the far horizon, such a slight change that he might feel he was imagining it out of his hopes, and there would be the new Sietch. "Does my decision suit Muad'Dib?" Stilgar asked. Only the faintest touch of sarcasm tinged his voice, but Fremen ears around them, alert to every tone in a bird's cry or Cialago's piping message, heard the sarcasm and watched Paul to see what he would do. "Stilgar heard me swear my loyalty to him when we consecrated the Fedaykin, Paul said. My deaf commandos know I spoke with honor. Does Stilgar doubt it? Real pain exposed itself in Paul's voice. Stilgar heard it and lowered his gaze. Usul, the companion of my siege. Him I would never doubt, Stilgar said. But you are Paul Muad'Dib, the Atreides Duke, and you are the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world. These men I don't even know. Paul turned away to watch the Habanya Ridge climb out of the desert. The maker beneath them still felt strong and willing. He could carry them almost twice the distance of any other in Fremen experience. He knew it. There was nothing outside the stories told to children that could match this old man of the desert. It was the stuff of a new legend, Paul realized. A hand gripped his shoulder. Paul looked at it, followed the arm to the face beyond it, the dark eyes of Stilgar exposed between filter mask and stillsuit hood. The one who led Taber Sietch before me, Stilgar said. He was my friend. We shared dangers. He owed me his life many a time, and I owed him mine. I am your friend, Stilgar, Paul said. No man doubts it, Stilgar said. He removed his hand, shrugged. It's the way. Paul saw that Stilgar was too immersed in the Fremen way to consider the possibility of any other. Here a leader took the reins from the dead hands of his predecessor, or slew among the strongest of his tribe if a leader died in the desert. Stilgar had reason to be a nabe in this way. We should leave this maker in deep sand, Paul said. Yes, Stilgar agreed. We could walk to the cave from here. We've ridden him far enough that he'll bury himself and sulk for a day or so, Paul said. You're the Mudir of the sand ride, Stilgar said. Say when we... He broke off, stared at the eastern sky. Paul whirled. The spice blew overcast as his eyes made the sky appear dark. A richly filtered azure against which a distant rhythmic flashing stood out in sharp contrast. Ornithopter. One small thopter, Stilgar said. Could be a scout, Paul said. Do you think they've seen us? At this distance we're just a worm on the surface, Stilgar said. He motioned with his left hand. Off. Scatter on the sand. The troop began working down the worm's sides, dropping off, blending with the sand beneath their cloaks. Paul marked where Chani dropped. Presently only he and Stilgar remained. First up, last off, Paul said. Stilgar nodded, dropped down the side on his hooks, leaped onto the sand. Paul waited until the maker was safely clear of the scatter area, then released his hooks. This was the tricky moment of a worm not completely exhausted. Freed of its goats and hooks, the big worm began burrowing into the sand. Paul ran lightly back along its broad surface, judged his moment carefully, and leaped off. He landed running, lunged against the slip face of a dune the way he had been taught, and hid himself beneath the cascade of sand over his robe. Now the waiting. Paul turned gently, exposed a crack of sky beneath a crease in his robe. He imagined the others looking back along their path doing the same. He heard the beat of the thopter's wings before he saw it. There was a whisper of jet pods, and it came over his patch of desert, turned in a broad arc toward the ridge. An unmarked thopter, Paul noted. It flew out of sight beyond Habanya Ridge. A bird cry sounded over the desert. Another. Paul shook himself free of sand, climbed to the dune top. Other figures stood out in a line trailing away from the ridge. He recognized Chani and Stilgar among them. Stilgar signaled toward the ridge. They gathered and began the sand walk, gliding over the surface in a broken rhythm that would disturb no maker. Stilgar paced himself beside Paul along the wind-packed crest of a dune. It was a smuggler craft, Stilgar said. So it seemed, Paul said, but this is deep into the desert, for smugglers. There are difficulties of patrols too, Stilgar said. If they come this deep, they may go deeper, Paul said. True. It wouldn't be well for them to see what they could see if they ventured too deep into the south. Smugglers sell information, too. They were hunting spice, don't you think? Stilgar asked. There will be a wing and a crawler waiting somewhere for that one, Paul said. We've spice. Let's bait a patch of sand and catch us some smugglers. They should be taught that this is our land, and our men need practice with the new weapons. Now Usul speaks, Stilgar said. Usul thinks Fremen. But Usul must give way to decisions that match a terrible purpose, Paul thought, and the storm was gathering. When law and duty are one, united by religion, you never become fully conscious, fully aware of yourself. You are always a little less than an individual. From Muad'Dib, the 99 Wonders of the Universe, by the Princess Irulan. The smuggler's spice factory with its parent carrier and ring of drone ornithopters came over a lifting of dunes like a swarm of insects following its queen. Ahead of the swarm lay one of the low rock ridges that lifted from the desert floor like small imitations of the shield wall. The dry beaches on the ridge were swept clean by a recent storm. In the con bubble of the factory, Gurney Halleck leaned forward, adjusted the oil lenses of his binoculars and examined the landscape. Beyond the ridge, he could see a dark patch that might be a spice blow, and he gave the signal to a hovering ornithopter that sent it to investigate. The thopter waggled its wings to indicate it had the signal. It broke away from the swarm, sped down toward the darkened sand, circled the area of its detectors dangling close to the surface. Almost immediately, it went through the wing-tucked dip and circle that told the waiting factory that spice had been found. Gurney sheathed his binoculars, knowing the others had seen the signal. He liked this spot. The ridge offered some shielding and protection. This was deep in the desert, an unlikely place for an ambush. Still, Gurney signaled for a crew to hover over the ridge, to scan it, sent reserves to take up station and pattern around the area, not too high because then they could be seen from afar by Harkonnen detectors. He doubted, though, that Harkonnen patrols would be this far south. This was still Fremen country. Gurney checked his weapons, damning the fate that made shields useless out here. Anything that summoned a worm had to be avoided at all costs. He rubbed the ink-vine scar along his jaw, studying the scene, decided it would be safest to lead a ground party through the ridge. Inspection on foot was still the most certain. You couldn't be too careful when Fremen and Harkonnen were at each other's throats. It was Fremen that worried him here. They didn't mind trading for all the spice you could afford, but they were devils on the warpath if you stepped foot where they forbade you to go. And they were so devilishly cunning of late. It annoyed Gurney, the cunning and adroitness in battle of these natives. They displayed a sophistication in warfare as good as anything he had ever encountered, and he had been trained by the best fighters in the universe, then seasoned in battles where only the superior few survived. Again, Gurney scanned the landscape, wondering why he felt uneasy. Perhaps it was the worm they had seen, but that was on the other side of the ridge. A head popped up into the con bubble beside Gurney. The factory commander, a one-eyed old pirate with full beard, the blue eyes and milky teeth of a space diet. "Looks like a rich patch, sir," the factory commander said. "Shall I take her in?" "Come down at the edge of that ridge," Gurney ordered. "Let me disembark with my men. You can track her out to the spice from there. We'll have a look at that rock." "Aye." "Case of trouble," Gurney said. "Save the factory. We'll lift in the thopters." The factory commander saluted. "Aye, sir." He popped back down through the hatch. Again, Gurney scanned the horizon. He had to respect the possibility that there were Fremen here, and he was trespassing. Fremen worried him, their toughness and unpredictability. Many things about this business worried him, but the rewards were great. The fact that he couldn't send spotters high overhead worried him too. The necessity of radio silence added to his uneasiness. The factory crawler turned, began to descend. Gently it glided down to the dry beach at the foot of the ridge. Treads touched sand. Gurney opened the bubble dome, released his safety straps. The instant the factory stopped, he was out, slamming the bubble close behind him, scrambling out over the tread guards to swing down to the sand beyond the emergency netting. The 5 men of his personal guard were out with him, emerging for the nose hatch. Others released the factory's carrier wing. It detached, lifted away to fly in a parking circle low overhead. Immediately the big factory crawler lurched off, swinging away from the ridge toward the dark patch of spice out on the sand. A thopter swooped down nearby, skidded to a stop. Another followed and another. They disgorged Gurney's platoon and lifted to hover flight. Gurney tested his muscles in his still suit, stretching. He left the filter mask off his face, losing moisture for the sake of a greater need, the carrying power of his voice if he had to shout commands. He began climbing up into the rocks, checking the terrain, pebbles and pea sand underfoot, the smell of spice. Good site for an emergency base, he thought. Might be sensible to bury a few supplies here. He glanced back, watching his men spread out as they followed him. Good men, even the new ones he hadn't had time to test. Good men. Didn't have to be told every time what to do. Not a shield glimmer showed on any of them. No cowards in this bunch, carrying shields into the desert where a worm could sense the field and come to rob them of the spice they found. From this slight elevation in the rocks, Gurney could see the spice patch about 1/2 kilometre away and the crawler just reaching the near edge. He glanced up at the cover flight, noting the altitude, not too high. He nodded to himself, turned to resume his climb up the ridge. In that instant, the ridge erupted. 12 roaring puffs of flame streaked upward to the hovering thopters and carrier wing. There came a blasting of metal from the factory crawler, and the rocks around Gurney were full of hooded fighting men. Gurney had time to think. By the horns of the Great Mother. Rockets. They dared to use rockets. Then he was face to face with a hooded figure who crouched low, eyes knife at the ready. 2 more men stood waiting on the rocks above to left and right. Only the eyes of the fighting man ahead of him were visible to Gurney between hood and veil of sand-coloured burnous, but the crouch and readiness warned him that here was a trained fighting man. The eyes were the blue and blue of the deep desert Fremen. Gurney moved one hand toward his own knife, kept his eyes fixed on the other's knife. They dared use rockets, but have other projectile weapons. This moment argued extreme caution. He could tell by sound alone that at least part of his sky cover had been knocked out. There were gruntings too, the noise of several struggles behind him. The eyes of the fighting man ahead of Gurney followed the motion of hand toward knife, came back to glare into Gurney's eyes. "Leave the knife in its sheath, Gurney Halleck," the man said. Gurney hesitated. That voice sounded oddly familiar even for a stillsuit filter. "You know my name?" he said. "You've no need of a knife with me, Gurney," the man said. He straightened, slipped his cryos knife into its sheath back beneath his robe. "Tell your men to stop their useless resistance." The man threw his hood back, swung the filter aside. The shock of what he saw froze Gurney's muscles. He thought at first he was looking at a ghost image of Duke Leto Atreides. Full recognition came slowly. "Paul," he whispered, then louder. "Is it truly Paul?" "Don't you trust your own eyes?" Paul asked. "They said you were dead." Gurney rasped. He took a half step forward. "Tell your men to submit," Paul commanded. He waved toward the lower reaches of the ridge. Gurney turned, reluctant to take his eyes off Paul. He saw only a few knots of struggle. Hooded desert men seemed to be everywhere around. The factory crawler lay silent with Fremen standing atop it. There were no aircraft overhead. "Stop the fighting!" Gurney bellowed. He took a deep breath, cupped his hands for a megaphone. "This is Gurney Halleck. Stop the fight." Cupped his hands for a megaphone. "This is Gurney Halleck. Stop the fight." Slowly, warily, the struggling figures separated. Eyes turned toward him, questioning. "These are friends," Gurney called. "Fine, friends," someone shouted back. "Half our people murdered." "It's a mistake," Gurney said. "Don't add to it." He turned back to Paul, stared into the youth's blue Fremen eyes. A smile touched Paul's mouth, but there was a hardness in the expression that reminded Gurney of the old Duke, Paul's grandfather. Gurney saw then the sinewy harshness in Paul that had never before been seen in an Atreides, a leathery look to the skin, a squint to the eyes and calculation in the glance that seemed to weigh everything in sight. "They said you were dead," Gurney repeated. "And it seemed the best protection to let them think so," Paul said. Paul realized that was all the apology he'd ever get for having been abandoned to his own resources, left to believe his young Duke, his friend, was dead. He wondered then if there were anything left here of the boy he had known and trained in the ways of fighting men. Paul took a step closer to Gurney, found that his eyes were smarting. "Gurney." It seemed to happen of itself, and they were embracing, pounding each other on the back, feeling the reassurance of solid flesh. You young pup, Gurney kept saying, and Paul, Gurney man. Presently they stepped apart, looked at each other. Gurney took a deep breath. "So you're why the Fremen have grown so wise in battle tactics. I might have known. They keep doing things I could have planned myself. If I'd only known." He shook his head. "If you'd only got word to me, lad, nothing would have stopped me. I'd have come a-running," and a look in Paul's eyes stopped him. The hard, weighing stare. Gurney sighed. "Sure, and there'd have been those who wondered why Gurney Halleck went a-running, and some would have done more than question. They'd have gone hunting for answers." Paul nodded, glanced at the waiting Fremen around them. The looks of curious appraisal on the faces of the Fedaykin. He turned from the deaf commandos back to Gurney. Finding his former swordmaster filled him with elation. He saw it as a good omen, a sign that he was on the course of the future where all was well. With Gurney at my side. Paul glanced down the ridge past the Fedaykin, studied the smuggler crew who had come with Halleck. "How do your men stand, Gurney?" he asked. "They're smugglers all," Gurney said. "They stand where the profit is. Little enough profit in our venture," Paul said, and he noted the subtle finger signal flashed to him by Gurney's right hand, the old hand code out of their past. There were men to fear and distrust in the smuggler crew. Paul pulled at his lip to indicate he understood, looked up at the men standing guard above them on the rocks. He saw Stilgar there. Memory of the unsolved problem with Stilgar cooled some of Paul's elation. "Stilgar," he said, "this is Gurney Halleck of whom you've heard me speak. My father's master of arms, one of the sword masters who instructed me, an old friend. He can be trusted in any venture." "I hear," Stilgar said. "You are his Duke." Paul stared at the dark visage above him, wondering at the reasons which had impelled Stilgar to say just that. His Duke. There had been a strange subtle intonation in Stilgar's voice, as though he would rather have said something else. And that wasn't like Stilgar, who was a leader of Fremen, a man who spoke his mind. "My Duke," Gurney thought. He looked anew at Paul. Yes, with Leto dead, the title fell on Paul's shoulders. The pattern of the Fremen war on Arrakis began to take on new shape in Gurney's mind. "My Duke." A place that had been dead within him began coming alive. Only part of his awareness focused on Paul's ordering the smuggler crew disarmed until they could be questioned. Gurney's mind returned to the command when he heard some of his men protesting. He shook his head, whirled. "Are you men deaf?" he barked. "This is the rightful Duke of Arrakis. Do as he commands." Grumbling, the smugglers submitted. Paul moved up beside Gurney, spoke in a low voice. "I'd not have expected you to walk into this trap, Gurney." "I'm properly chastened," Gurney said. "I'll wager yon patch of spice is little more than a sand grain's thickness, a bait to lure us. That's a wager you'd win," Paul said. He looked down at the men being disarmed. "Are there any more of my father's men among your crew?" "None. We've spread thin. There are a few among the free traders. Most have spent their profits to leave this place." "But you stayed?" "I stayed. Because Raban is here?" Paul said. "I thought I had nothing left but revenge," Gurney said. An oddly chopped cry sounded from the ridge-top. Gurney looked up to see a Fremen waving his kerchief. "A maker comes," Paul said. He moved out to a point of rock with Gurney following, looking off to the southwest. The burrow mound of a worm could be seen in the middle distance, a dust-crowned track that cut directly through the dunes on a course toward the ridge. "He's big enough," Paul said. A clattering sound lifted from the factory crawler below them. It turned on its treads like a giant insect, lumbered toward the rocks. "Too bad we couldn't have saved the carryall," Paul said. Gurney glanced at him, looked back to the patches of smoke and debris out on the desert, where carryall and ornithopters had been brought down by Fremen rockets. He felt a sudden pang for the men lost there, his men, and he said, "Your father would have been more concerned for the men he couldn't save." Paul shot a hard stare at him, lowered his gaze. Presently he said, "They were your friends, Gurney. I understand. To us, though, they were trespassers who might see things they shouldn't see. You must understand that." "I understand it well enough," Gurney said. "Now I'm curious to see what I shouldn't." Paul looked up to see the old and well-remembered wolfish grin on Halleck's face, the ripple of the ink-vine scar along the man's jaw. Gurney nodded toward the desert below them. Fremen were going about their business all over the landscape. It struck him that none of them appeared worried by the approach of the worm. A thumping sounded from the open dunes beyond the baited patch of spice, a deep drumming that seemed to be heard through their feet. Gurney saw Fremen spread out across the sand there in the path of the worm. The worm came up like some great sandfish, cresting the surface, its rings rippling and twisting. In a moment, from his vantage point above the desert, Gurney saw the taking of a worm, the daring leap of the first hook man, the turning of the creature, the way an entire band of men went up the scaly, glistening curve of the worm's side. "There's one of the things you shouldn't have seen," Paul said. "There have been stories and rumours," Gurney said. "But it's not a thing easy to believe without seeing it." He shook his head. "The creature all men on Arrakis fear, you treat it like a riding animal." "You heard my father speak of desert power," Paul said. "There it is. The surface of this planet is ours. No storm, nor creature, nor condition can stop us." "Us," Gurney thought. "He means the Fremen. He speaks of himself as one of them." Again, Gurney looked at the spice blue in Paul's eyes. His own eyes, he knew, had a touch of the colour, but smugglers could get off-world foods, and there was a subtle caste implication in the tone of the eyes among them. They spoke of the touch of the spice brush to mean a man had gone too native, and there was always a hint of distrust in the idea. "There was a time when we did not ride the Maker in the light of day in these latitudes," Paul said. "The Raban has little enough air cover left that he can waste it looking for a few specks in the sand." He looked at Gurney. "Your aircraft were a shock to us here." "To us. To us." Gurney shook his head to drive out such thoughts. "We weren't the shock to you that you were to us," he said. "What's the talk of Raban in the sinks and villages?" Paul asked. "They say they've fortified the Graben villages to the point where you cannot harm them. They say they need only sit inside their defences while you wear yourselves out in futile attack." "In a word," Paul said, "they're immobilized." "While you can go where you will," Gurney said. "It's a tactic I learned from you," Paul said. "They've lost the initiative, which means they've lost the war." Gurney smiled a slow, knowing expression. "Our enemy is exactly where I want him to be," Paul said. He glanced at Gurney. "Well, Gurney, do you enlist with me for the finish of this campaign?" "Enlist?" Gurney stared at him. "My lord, I've never left your service. You're the one left me, to think you dead. And I, being cast adrift, made what shrift I could, waiting for the moment I might sell my life for what it's worth. The death of Raban." An embarrassed silence settled over Paul. A woman came climbing up the rocks toward them, her eyes between stillsuit hood and face mask flicking between Paul and his companion. She stopped in front of Paul. Gurney noted the possessive air about her, the way she stood close to Paul. "Shani," Paul said, "this is Gurney Halleck. You've heard me speak of him." She looked at Halleck, back to Paul. I have heard. Where did the men go on the Maker? Paul asked. They but diverted it to give us time to save the equipment. Well then, Paul broke off, sniffed the air. There's wind coming, Charney said. A voice called from the ridgetop above them. Ho there! The wind! Gurney saw a quickening of motion among the Fremen now, a rushing about and sense of hurry. A thing the worm had not ignited was brought about by fear of the wind. The factory crawler lumbered up onto the dry breach below them, and a way was opened for it among the rocks, and the rocks closed behind it so neatly that the passage escaped his eyes. Have you many such hiding places? Gurney asked. Many times many, Paul said. He looked at Charney. Find Korba. Tell him that Gurney has warned me there are men among the smuggler crew who are not to be trusted. She looked once at Gurney, back to Paul, nodded, and was off down the rocks, leaping with a gazelle-like agility. She is your woman, Gurney said. The mother of my firstborn, Paul said. There's another Leto among the Atreides. Gurney accepted this with only a widening of the eyes. Paul watched the action around them with a critical eye. A curry colour dominated the southern sky now, and there came fitful bursts and gusts of wind that whipped dust around their heads. Seal your suit, Paul said, and he fastened the mask and hood about his face. Gurney obeyed, thankful for the filters. Paul spoke, his voice muffled by the filter. Which of your crew don't you trust, Gurney? There are some new recruits, Gurney said. Offwalders. He hesitated, wondering at himself suddenly. Offwalders. The word had come so easily to his tongue. Yes, Paul said. They're not like the usual fortune-hunting lot we get, Gurney said. They are tougher. Harkonnen spies? Paul asked. I think, my lord, for they report to no Harkonnen. I suspect they're men of the Imperial service. They have a hint of Seleucus Secundus about them. Paul shot a sharp glance at him. Sardaukar? Gurney shrugged. They could be, but it's well masked. Paul nodded, thinking how easily Gurney had fallen back into the pattern of Atreides' retainer, but with subtle reservations, differences. Arrakis had changed him, too. Two hooded Fremen emerged from the broken rock below them, began climbing upward. One of them carried a large black bundle over one shoulder. Where are my crew now? Gurney asked. Secure in the rocks below us, Paul said. We have a cave here, cave of birds. We'll decide what to do with them after the storm. A voice called from above them. Muad'Dib! Paul turned at the call, saw a Fremen guard motioning them down to the cave. Paul signalled he had heard. Gurney was studying him with a new expression. You're Muad'Dib? He asked. You're the Will of the Sand? It's my Fremen name, Paul said. Gurney turned away, feeling an oppressive sense of foreboding. Half his own crew dead on the sand, the others captive. He did not care about the new recruits, the suspicious ones, but among the others were good men, friends, people for whom he felt responsible. We'll decide what to do with them after the storm. That's what Paul had said, Muad'Dib had said. And Gurney recalled the stories told of Muad'Dib, Felissa and Al-Gaib, how he had taken the skin of a Harkonnen officer to make his drumheads, how he was surrounded by deaf commandos, Fedaykin who leaped into battle with their deaf chants on their lips. Him. The two Fremen climbing up the rocks leaped lightly to a shelf in front of Paul. The dark-faced one said, All secure, Muad'Dib. We best get below now. Right. Gurney noted the tone of the man's voice, half command and half request. This was the man called Stilgar, another figure of the new Fremen legends. Paul looked at the bundle the other man carried, said, Korba, what's in the bundle? Stilgar answered, 'Twas in the crawler. It had the initial of your friend here and it contains a balisette. Many times have I heard you speak of the prowess of Gurney Halleck on the balisette. Gurney studied the speaker, seeing the edge of black beard above the steel-suit mask, the hawk stare, the chiselled nose. You've a companion who thinks, my lord, Gurney said. Thank you, Stilgar. Stilgar signalled for his companion to pass the bundle to Gurney, said, Thank you, your Lord Duke. His countenance earns your admittance here. Gurney accepted the bundle, puzzled by the hard undertones in this conversation. There was an air of challenge about the man, and Gurney wondered if it could be a feeling of jealousy in the Fremen. Here was someone called Gurney Halleck who'd known Paul even in the times before Arrakis, a man who shared a camaraderie that Stilgar could never invade. You are two I'd have to be friends, Paul said. Stilgar the Fremen is a name of renown, Gurney said. Any killer of Harkonnens I'd feel honoured to count among my friends. Will you touch hands with my friend Gurney Halleck, Stilgar? Paul asked. Slowly, Stilgar extended his hand, gripped the heavy calluses of Gurney's sword hand. There are few who haven't heard the name of Gurney Halleck, he said, and released his grip. He turned to Paul. The storm comes rushing. At once, Paul said. Stilgar turned away, led them down through the rocks, a twisting and turning path into a shadowed cleft that admitted them to the low entrance of a cave. Men hurried to fasten a door seal behind them. Glow globes showed a broad, dome-ceilinged space with a raised ledge on one side and a passage leading off from it. Paul leaped to the ledge of Gurney right behind him, led the way into the passage. The others headed for another passage opposite the entrance. Paul led the way through an anteroom and into a chamber with dark, wine-coloured hangings on its walls. "We can have some privacy here for a while," Paul said. "The others will respect my—" An alarm cymbal clanged from the outer chamber, was followed by shouting and clashing of weapons. Paul whirled, ran back through the anteroom and out onto the atrium lip above the outer chamber. Gurney was right behind him, weapon drawn. Beneath them on the floor of the cave swirled a melee of struggling figures. Paul stood an instant assessing the scene, separating the Fremen robes and burqas from the costumes of those there posed. Senses that his mother had trained to detect the most subtle clues picked out a significant fact. The Fremen fought against men wearing smuggler robes, but the smugglers were crouched in trios, backed into triangles where pressed. That habit of close fighting was a trademark of the Imperial Sardaukar. A Fedaykin in the crowd saw Paul, and his battle cry was lifted to echo in the chamber. "Muad'Dib! Muad'Dib! Muad'Dib!" Another eye had also picked Paul out. A black knife came hurtling toward him. Paul dodged, heard the knife clatter against stone behind him, glanced to see Gurney retrieve it. The triangular knots were being pressed back now. Gurney held the knife up in front of Paul's eyes, pointed to the hairline yellow coil of imperial colour, the golden lion crest, the multifaceted eyes at the pommel. Sardaukar for certain. Paul stepped out to the lip of the ledge. Only 3 of the Sardaukar remained. Bloody ragmounds of Sardaukar and Fremen lay in a twisted pattern across the chamber. "Hold!" Paul shouted. "The Duke Paul Atreides commands you to hold." The fighting wavered, hesitated. "You Sardaukar," Paul called to the remaining group. "By whose orders do you threaten a ruling Duke?" And quickly, as his men started to press in around the Sardaukar. "Hold, I say." One of the cornered trio straightened. "Who says we're Sardaukar?" he demanded. Paul took the knife from Gurney, held it aloft. "This says you're Sardaukar." "Then who says you're a ruling Duke?" the man demanded. Paul gestured to the Fedaykin. "These men say I'm a ruling Duke. Your own emperor bestowed Arrakis on House Atreides. I am House Atreides." The Sardaukar stood silent, fidgeting. Paul studied the man, tall, flat-featured, with a pale scar across half his left cheek. Anger and confusion were betrayed in his manner, but still there was that pride about him without which a Sardaukar appeared undressed, and with which he could appear fully clothed, though naked. Paul glanced to one of his Fedaykin lieutenants, said, "Korba, how came they to have weapons?" "They held back knives concealed in cunning pockets within their stillsuits," the lieutenant said. Paul surveyed the dead and wounded across the chamber, brought his attention back to the lieutenant. There was no need for words. The lieutenant lowered his eyes. "Where is Chani?" Paul asked and waited, breath held, for the answer. Stilgar spirited her aside. He nodded toward the other passage, glanced at the dead and wounded. "I hold myself responsible for this mistake, Muad'Dib." "How many of these Sardaukar were there, Gurney?" Paul asked. 10. Paul leaped lightly to the floor of the chamber, strode across to stand within striking distance of the Sardaukar spokesman. A tense air came over the Fedaykin. They did not like him thus exposed to danger. This was the thing they were pledged to prevent because the Fremen wished to preserve the wisdom of Muad'Dib. Without turning, Paul spoke to his lieutenant. "How many are our casualties?" 4 wounded, 2 dead, Muad'Dib. Paul saw the motion behind the Sardaukar. Chani and Stilgar were standing in the other passage. He returned his attention to the Sardaukar, staring into the off-world whites of the spokesman's eyes. "You, what is your name?" Paul demanded. The man stiffened, glanced left and right. "Don't try it," Paul said. "It's obvious to me that you were ordered to seek out and destroy Muad'Dib. I'll warrant you were the one suggested seeking spice in the deep desert." A gasp from Gurney behind him brought a thin smile to Paul's lips. Blood suffused Sardakar's face. "What you see before you is more than Muad'Dib," Paul said. 7 of you are dead for 2 of us. 3 for 1. Pretty good against Sardaukar, eh? The man came up on his toes, sank back as the Fedaykin pressed forward. "I asked your name," Paul said, and he called up the subtleties of voice. "Tell me your name." "Captain Aramsham, Imperial Sardaukar," the man snapped. His jaw dropped. He stared at Paul in confusion. The manner about him that had dismissed this cavern as a barbarian warren melted away. "Well, Captain Aramsham," Paul said, "the Harkonnens would pay dearly to learn what you know now. And the Emperor, what he wouldn't give to learn that Atreides still lives despite his treachery." The captain glanced left and right at the 2 men remaining to him. Paul could almost see the thoughts turning over in the man's head. Sardaukar did not submit, but the Emperor had to learn of this threat. Still using the voice, Paul said, "Submit, Captain." The man at the captain's left leaped without warning toward Paul, met the flashing impact of his own captain's knife in his chest. The attacker hit the floor in a sodden heap with the knife still in him. The captain faced his sole remaining companion. "I decide what best serves His Majesty," he said. "Understood?" The other Sardakar's shoulders slumped. "Drop your weapon," the captain said. The Sardaukar obeyed. The captain returned his attention to Paul. "I have killed a friend for you," he said. "Let us always remember that." "You're my prisoners," Paul said. "You submitted to me. Whether you live or die is of no importance." He motioned to his guard to take the two Sardaukar, signaled the lieutenant who had searched the prisoners. The guard moved in, hustled the Sardaukar away. Paul bent toward his lieutenant. "Muad'Dib," the man said. "I failed you in. The failure was mine, Korba," Paul said. "I should have warned you what to seek. In the future, when searching Sardaukar, remember this. Remember, too, that each has a false toenail or two that can be combined with other items secreted about their bodies to make an effective transmitter. They'll have more than one false tooth. They carry coils of Shiga wire in their hair, so fine you can barely detect it, yet strong enough to garrote a man and cut off his head in the process. With Sardaukar, you must scan them, scope them, both reflex and hard ray, cut off every scrap of body hair, and when you're through, be certain you haven't discovered everything." He looked up at Gurney, who had moved close to listen. "Then we best kill them," the lieutenant said. Paul shook his head, still looking at Gurney. "No, I want them to escape." Gurney stared at him. "Sire," he breathed. "Yes? Your man here is right. Kill those prisoners at once. Destroy all evidence of them. You've shamed Imperial Sardaukar. When the Emperor learns that, he'll not rest until he has you over a slow fire. The Emperor's not likely to have that power over me," Paul said. He spoke slowly, coldly. Something had happened inside him while he faced the Sardaukar. A sum of decisions had accumulated in his awareness. "Gurney," he said, "are there many guildsmen around Raban?" Gurney straightened, eyes narrowed. "Your question makes no... Are there?" Paul barked. "Arrakis is crawling with guild agents. They're buying spice as though it were the most precious thing in the universe." "Why else do you think we ventured this far into... It is the most precious thing in the universe," Paul said. "To them." He looked towards Stilgar and Chani, who now were crossing the chamber toward him. "And we control it, Gurney." "The Harkonnens control it," Gurney protested. "The people who can destroy a thing, they control it," Paul said. He waved a hand to silence further remarks from Gurney, nodded to Stilgar, who stopped in front of Paul, Chani beside him. Paul took the Sardaukar knife in his left hand, presented it to Stilgar. "You live for the good of the tribe," Paul said. "Could you draw my life's blood with that knife?" "For the good of the tribe," Stilgar growled. "Then use that knife," Paul said. "Are you calling me out?" Stilgar demanded. "If I do," Paul said, "I shall stand there without weapon and let you slay me." Stilgar drew in a quick, sharp breath. Chani said, "Yusul!" then glanced at Gurney, back to Paul. While Stilgar was still weighing his words, Paul said, "You are Stilgar, a fighting man. When the Sardaukar began fighting here, you were not in the front of battle. Your first thought was to protect Chani." "She's my niece," Stilgar said. "If there had been any doubt of your Fedayk in handling those scum." "Why was your first thought of Chani?" Paul demanded. "It wasn't." "Oh?" "It was of you," Stilgar admitted. "Do you think you could lift your hand against me?" Paul asked. Stilgar began to tremble. "It's the way," he muttered. "It's the way to kill off old strangers found in the desert and take their water as a gift from Shai Hulud," Paul said. "That you permitted to such to live one night, my mother and myself." As Stilgar remained silent, trembling, staring at him, Paul said, "Ways change still. You have changed them yourself." Stilgar looked down at the yellow emblem on the knife he held. "Well, I am Duke Onarakin with Chani by my side. Do you think I'll have time to concern myself with every detail of governing Sietch Tabor?" Paul asked. "Do you concern yourself with the internal problems of every family?" Stilgar continued staring at the knife. "Do you think I wish to cut off my right arm?" Paul demanded. Slowly, Stilgar looked up at him. "You," Paul said. "Do you think I wish to deprive myself or the tribe of your wisdom and strength?" In a low voice, Stilgar said, "The young man of my tribe whose name is known to me. This young man I could kill on the challenge floor, Shai Hulud willing. To listen al-Gaib, him I could not harm. You knew this when you handed me this knife." "I knew it," Paul agreed. Stilgar opened his hand. The knife clattered against the stone of the floor. "Ways change," he said. "Chani," Paul said, "go to my mother, send her here, that her counsel will be available in." "But you said we would go to the south," she protested. "I was wrong," he said. "The Harkonnens are not there. The war is not there." She took a deep breath, accepting this as a desert woman accepted all necessities in the midst of a life involved with death. "You'll give my mother a message for her ears alone," Paul said. "Tell her that Stilgar acknowledges me Duke of Arrakis, but a way must be found to make the young man accept this without combat." Chani glanced at Stilgar. "Do as he says," Stilgar growled. "We both know he could overcome me, and I could not raise my hand against him, for the good of the tribe." "I shall return with your mother," Chani said. "Send her," Paul said. Stilgar's instinct was right. "I am stronger when you are safe. You will remain in the siege." She started to protest, swallowed it. Sihaya, Paul said, using his intimate name for her. He whirled away to the right, met Gurney's glaring eyes. The interchange between Paul and the older Fremen had passed as though in a cloud around Gurney since Paul's reference to his mother. Your mother, Gurney said. Idaho saved us the night of the raid, Paul said, distracted by the parting of Chani. Right now what of Duncan Idaho, my lord? Gurney asked. He's dead, buying us a bit of time to escape. The she-witch alive, Gurney thought. The one I swore vengeance against alive. And it's obvious Duke Paul doesn't know what matter of creature gave him birth. The evil one. Betrayed his own father to the Harkonnens. Paul pressed past him, jumped up to the ledge. He glanced back, noted that the wounded and dead had been removed, and he thought bitterly that here was another chapter in the legend of Paul Muad'Dib. I didn't even draw my knife, but it'll be said of this day, I slew 20 Sardaukar by my own hand. Gurney followed with Stilgar, stepping on ground that he did not even feel. The cavern with its yellow light of glow globes was forced out of his thoughts by rage, the she-witch alive while those she betrayed our bones in lonesome graves. I must contrive that Paul learns the truth about her before I slay her. How often it is that the angry man rages denial of what his inner self is telling him. The Collected Sayings of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan. The crowd in the cavern assembly chamber radiated that packed feeling Jessica had sensed about the day Paul killed Jamis. There was murmuring nervousness in the voices. Little cliques gathered like knots among the robes. Jessica touched a message cylinder beneath her robe as she emerged to the ledge from Paul's private quarters. She felt rested after the long journey up from the south, but it still rankled that Paul would not yet permit them to use the captured ornithopters. We do not have full control of the air, he had said, and we must not become dependent upon off-world fuel. Both fuel and aircraft must be gathered and saved for the day of maximum effort. Paul stood with a group of the younger men near the ledge. The pale light of the glow globes gave the scene a tinge of unreality. It was like a tableau, with the added dimension of warren smells, the whispers, the sounds of shuffling feet. She studied her son, wondering why he had not yet trotted on out his surprise, Gurney Halleck. Thought of Gurney disturbed her with its memories of an easier past, days of love and beauty with Paul's father. Stilgar waited with a small group of his own at the other end of the ledge. There was a feeling of inevitable dignity about him, the way he stood without talking. We must not lose that man, Jessica thought. Paul's plan must work. Anything else would be highest tragedy. She strode down the ledge, passing Stilgar without a glance, stepped down into the crowd. A way was made for her as she headed toward Paul, and silence followed her. She knew the meaning of the silence, the unspoken questions of the people, awe of the Reverend Mother. The young man drew back from Paul as she came up to him, and she found herself momentarily dismayed by the new deference they paid him. All men beneath your position covet your station, went the Bene Gesserit axiom, but she found no covetousness in these faces. They were held at a distance by the religious ferment around Paul's leadership, and she recalled another Bene Gesserit saying, "Prophets have a way of dying by violence." Paul looked at her. "It's time," she said, and passed the message cylinder to him. One of Paul's companions, bolder than the others, glanced across at Stilgar, said, "Are you going to call him out, Muad'Dib? Now's the time for sure. They'll think you a coward if you—" "Who dares call me coward?" Paul demanded. His hand flashed his quai's knife hilt. Bated silence came over the group, spreading out into the crowd. "There's work to do," Paul said as the man drew back from him. Paul turned away, shouldered through the crowd to the ledge, leaped lightly up to it and faced her people. "Do it!" someone shrieked. Murmurs and whispers arose behind the shriek. Paul waited for silence. It came slowly amidst scattered shufflings and coughs. When it was quiet in the cavern, Paul lifted his chin, spoke in a voice that carried to the farthest corners. "You are tired of waiting," Paul said. Again he waited while the cries of response died out. Indeed they are tired of waiting, Paul thought. He hefted the message cylinder, thinking of what it contained. His mother had showed it to him, explaining how it had been taken from a Harkonnen courier. The message was explicit. Raban was being abandoned to his own resources here on Arrakis. He could not call for help or reinforcements. Again, Paul raised his voice. "You think it's time I called out Stilgar and changed the leadership of the troops?" Before they could respond, Paul hurled his voice at them in anger. "Do you think the Lisan al-Gaib that stupid?" There was stunned silence. "He's accepting the religious mantle," Jessica thought. "He must not do it." "It's the way," someone shouted. Paul spoke dryly, lifted from a corner of the cavern. "We'll say what's to change." There were scattered shouts of agreement through the throng. "As you wish," Paul said. And Jessica heard the subtle intonations as he used the powers of voice she had taught him. "You will say," he agreed, "but first you will hear my say." Stilgar moved along the ledge, his bearded face impassive. "That is the way too," he said. "The voice of any Fremen may be heard in council. Paul Muad'Dib is a Fremen. The good of the tribe, that is the most important thing, eh? Paul asked. Still with that flat-voiced dignity, Stilgar said, Thus our steps are guided. All right, Paul said. Then, who rules this troop of our tribe? And who rules all the tribes and troops through the fighting instructors we've trained in the Weirding Way? Paul waited, looking over the heads of the throng. No answer came. Presently he said, Does Stilgar rule all this? He says himself that he does not. Do I rule? Even Stilgar does my bidding on occasion, and the sages, the wisest of the wise, listen to me in harmony and counsel. There was shuffling silence among the crowd. So, Paul said, does my mother rule? He pointed down to Jessica in her black robes of office among them. Stilgar and all the other troop leaders ask her advice in almost every major decision. You know this. But does a reverend mother walk the sand or lead a razzia against the Harkonnens? Crowns creased the foreheads of those Paul could see, but still there were angry murmurs. This is a dangerous way to do it, Jessica thought, but she remembered the message cylinder and what it implied. And she saw Paul's intent. Go right to the depth of their uncertainty, dispose of that, and all the rest must follow. No man recognizes leadership without the challenge in the combat, eh? Paul asked. That's the way, someone shouted. What's our goal? Paul asked. To unseat Raban, the Harkonnen beast, and remake our world into a place where we may raise our families in happiness amidst an abundance of water? Is this our goal? Hard tasks need hard ways, someone shouted. Do you smash your knife before a battle? Paul demanded. I say this is fact, not meaning it as boast or challenge. There isn't a man here, Stilgar included, who could stand against me in single combat. This is Stilgar's own admission. He knows it, so do you all. Again the angry mutters lifted from the crowd. Many of you have been with me on the practice floor, Paul said. You know this isn't idle boast. I say it because it's fact, be it known to us all, and I'd be foolish not to see it for myself. I began training in these ways earlier than you did, and my teachers were tougher than any you've ever seen. How else do you think I bested Jamis at an age when your boys are still fighting only mock battles? He uses the voice well, Jessica thought. That's not enough with these people. They've good insulation against vocal control. He must catch them also with logic. So, Paul said, we come to this. He lifted the message cylinder, removed its scrap of tape. This was taken from a Harkonnen courier. Its authenticity is beyond question. It is addressed to Raban. Tells him that his request for new troops is denied, that his spice harvest is far below quota, that he must wring more spice from Arrakis of the people he has. Stilgar moved up beside Paul. How many of you see what this means? Paul asked. Stilgar saw it immediately. They're cut off, someone shouted. Paul pushed message and cylinder into his sash. From his neck he took a braided shingo wire cord and removed a ring from the cord, holding the ring aloft. This was my father's ducal signet, he said. I swore never to wear it again until I was ready to lead my troops over all of Arrakis and claim it as my rightful fief. He put the ring on his finger, clenched his fist. Utter stillness gripped the cavern. Who rules here? Paul asked. He raised his fist. I rule here. I rule in every square inch of Arrakis. This is my ducal fief, whether the Emperor says yea or nay. He gave it to my father, and it comes to me through my father. Paul lifted himself onto his toes, settled back to his heels. He studied the crowd, feeling their temper. Almost, he thought. There are men here who will hold positions of importance on Arrakis when I claim those imperial rights which are mine. Paul said. Stilgar is one of those men. Not because I wish to bribe him. Not out of gratitude, though. Not out of gratitude, though I'm one of many here who owe him life for life. No, but because he's wise and strong. Because he governs this troop by his own intelligence and not just by rules. Do you think me stupid? Do you think I'll cut off my right arm and leave it bloody on the floor of this cavern just to provide you with a circus? Paul swept a hard gaze across the throng. Who is there here to say I'm not the rightful ruler on Arrakis? Must I prove it by leaving every Fremen tribe in the Urg without a leader? Beside Paul, Stilgar stirred, looked at him questioningly. Will I subtract from our strength when we need it most? Paul asked. I am your ruler, and I say to you that it is time we stopped killing off our best men and started killing our real enemies, the Harkonnens. In one blurred motion, Stilgar had his cries knife out and pointed over the heads of the throng. Long live Duke Paul Muad'Dib, he shouted. A deafening roar filled the cavern, echoed and re-echoed. They were cheering and chanting, Yahya Shuhada, Muad'Dib, 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 Yahya Shuhada. Jessica translated it to herself. Long live the fighters of Muad'Dib. The scene she and Paul and Stilgar had cooked up between them had worked as they'd planned. The tumult died slowly. When silence was restored, Paul faced Stilgar, said, Kneel, Stilgar. Stilgar dropped to his knees on the ledge. Hand me your cries knife, Paul said. Stilgar obeyed. This was not as we planned it, Jessica thought. Repeat after me, Stilgar, Paul said. And he called up the words of investiture as he had heard his own father use them. I, Stilgar, take this knife from the hands of my duke. I, Stilgar, take this knife from the hands of my duke. Stilgar said, and accepted the milky blade from Paul. Where my duke commands, there shall I place this blade, Paul said. Stilgar repeated the words, speaking slowly and solemnly. Remembering the source of the rite, Jessica blinked back tears, shook her head. I know the reasons for this, she thought. I shouldn't let it stir me. I dedicate this blade to the cause of my duke and the death of his enemies for as long as our blood shall flow, Paul said. Stilgar repeated it after him. Kiss the blade, Paul ordered. Stilgar obeyed, then in the Fremen manner kissed Paul's knife arm. At a nod from Paul, he sheathed the blade, got to his feet. A sighing whisper of awe passed through the crowd, and Jessica heard the words. The prophecy, Bene Gesserit shall show the way, and a reverend mother shall see it. And from farther away, she shows us through her son. Stilgar leads this tribe, Paul said. Let no man mistake that. He commands with my voice. When he tells you, it is as though I told you. Wise, Jessica thought. The tribal commander must lose no face among those who should obey him. Paul lowered his voice, said, Stilgar, I want sandwalkers out this night and Cielago sent to summon a council gathering. When you've sent them, bring Chat, Korba, and Ophaim, and 2 other lieutenants of your own choosing. Bring them to my quarters for battle planning. We must have a victory to show the council of leaders when they arrive. Paul nodded for his mother to accompany him, led the way down off the ledge and through the throng toward the central passage and the living chambers that had been prepared there. As Paul pressed through the crowd, hands reached out to touch him, voices called out to him. My knife goes where Stilgar commands it, Paul Muad'Dib. Let us fight soon, Paul Muad'Dib. Let us wet our world with the blood of our Conans. Feeling the emotions of the throng, Jessica sensed the fighting edge of these people. They could not be more ready. We are taking them at the crest, she thought. In the inner chamber, Paul motioned his mother to be seated. Said, Wait here. And he ducked through the hangings to the side passage. It was quiet in the chamber after Paul had gone, so quiet behind the hangings that not even the faint soughing of the wind pumps that circulated air in the siege penetrated to where she sat. He's going to bring Gurney Halleck here, she thought, and she wondered at the strange mingling of emotions that filled her. Gurney and his music had been a part of so many pleasant times on Caladan before the move to Arrakis. She felt that Caladan had happened to some other person. In the nearly 3 years since then, she had become another person. Having to confront Gurney forced a reassessment of the changes. Paul's coffee service, the fluted alloy of silver and jasmium that he had inherited from Jamis, rested on a low table to her right. She stared at it, thinking of how many hands had touched that metal. Shani had served Paul from it within the month. What can his desert woman do for a duke except serve him coffee, she asked herself. She brings him no power, no family. Paul has only one major chance, to ally himself with a powerful great house, perhaps even of the imperial family. There are marriageable princesses, after all, and every one of them Bene Gesserit trained. Jessica imagined herself leaving the rigors of Arrakis for the life of power and security she could know as mother of a royal consort. She glanced at the thick hangings that obscured the rock of this cavern cell, thinking of how she had come here, riding amidst a host of worms, the palanquins and pack platforms piled high with necessities for the coming campaign. As long as Chani lives, Paul will not see his duty, Jessica thought. She has given him a son, and that is enough. A sudden longing to see her grandson, the child whose likeness carried so much of the grandfather's features, so like Leto, swept through her. Jessica placed her palms against her cheeks, began the ritual breathing that stilled emotion and clarified the mind, then bent forward from the waist in the devotional exercise that prepared the body for the mind's demands. Paul's choice of this cave of birds as his command post could not be questioned, she knew. It was ideal, and to the north lay Wind Pass opening onto a protected village in a cliff-walled sink. It was a key village, home of artisans and technicians, maintenance centre for an entire Harkonnen defensive sector. A cough sounded outside the chamber hangings. Jessica straightened, took a deep breath, exhaled slowly. Enter, she said. Draperies were flung aside, and Gurney Halleck bounded into the room. She had only time for a glimpse of his face with its odd grimace. Then he was behind her, lifting her to her feet with one brawny arm beneath her chin. Gurney, you fool, what are you doing? She demanded, and she felt the touch of the knife tip against her back. Chill awareness spread out from that knife tip. She knew in that instant that Gurney meant to kill her. Why? She could think of no reason, for he wasn't the kind to turn traitor, but she felt certain of his intention. Knowing it, her mind churned. Here was no man to be overcome easily. Here was a killer wary of the voice, wary of every combat stratagem, wary of every trick of death and violence. Here was an instrument she herself had helped train of subtle hints and suggestions. You thought you had escaped, eh, witch? Gurney snarled. Before she could turn the question over in her mind or try to answer, the curtains parted and Paul entered. Here he is, muff, Paul broke off, taking in the tensions of the scene. You will stand where you are, my lord, Gurney said. What? Paul shook his head. Jessica started to speak, felt the arm tighten against her throat. He'll speak only when I permit it, witch, Gurney said. I want only one thing from you, for your son to hear it. And I am prepared to send this knife into your heart by reflex. At the first sign of a counter against me, your voice will remain in a monotone. Certain muscles you will not tense or move. You will act with the most extreme caution to gain yourself a few more seconds of life, and I assure you, these are all you have. Paul took a step forward. Gurney, man, what is... Stop right where you are, Gurney snapped. One more step and she's dead. Paul's hand slipped to his knife hilt. He spoke in a deadly quiet. You had best explain yourself, Gurney. I swore an oath to slay the betrayer of your father, Gurney said. Do you think I can forget the man who rescued me from a Harkonnen slave pit, gave me freedom, life, and honor, and gave friendship, a thing I prized above all else? I have his betrayer under my knife. No one can stop me from... You couldn't be more wrong, Gurney, Paul said. Jessica thought, so that's it. What irony. Wrong, am I? Gurney demanded. Let us hear it from the woman herself. Let her remember that I have bribed and spied and cheated to confirm this charge. I've even pushed Semuta on a Harkonnen guard captain to get part of the story. Jessica felt the arm at her throat ease slightly, but before she could speak, Paul said, The betrayer was Yue. I tell you this once, Gurney. The evidence is complete, cannot be controverted. It was Yue. I do not care how you came by your suspicion, for it can be nothing else. But if you harm my mother... Paul lifted his cry's knife from its scabbard, held the blade in front of him. I'll have your blood. Yue was a conditioned medic, fit for a royal house, Gurney snarled. He could not turn traitor. I know a way to remove that conditioning, Paul said. Evidence, Gurney insisted. The evidence is not here, Paul said. It's in Tabo Sietch, far to the south. But if this is a trick, Gurney snarled, and his arm tightened on Jessica's throat. No trick, Gurney, Paul said, and his voice carried such a note of terrible sadness that the sound tore at Jessica's heart. I saw the message captured from the Harkonnen agent, Gurney said. The note pointed directly at... I saw it too, Paul said. My father showed it to me the night he explained why it had to be a Harkonnen trick aimed at making him suspect the woman he loved. Aya, Gurney said. You've not... Be quiet, Paul said, and the monotone stillness of his words carried more command than Jessica had ever heard in another voice. He has the great control, she thought. Gurney's arm trembled against her neck. The point of the knife at her back moved with uncertainty. What you have not done, Paul said, is heard my mother sobbing in the night over her lost Duke. You have not seen her eyes stab flame when she speaks of killing Harkonnens. So he has listened, she thought. Tears blinded her eyes. What you have not done, Paul went on, is remembered the lessons you learned in a Harkonnen slave pit. You speak of pride in my father's friendship. Didn't you learn the difference between Harkonnen and Atreides so that you could smell a Harkonnen trick by the stink they left on it? Didn't you learn that Atreides' loyalty is brought with love while the Harkonnen coin is hate? Couldn't you see through to the very nature of this betrayal? But Yue, Gurney muttered. The evidence we have is Yue's own message to us admitting his treachery, Yue said. I swear this to you by the love I hold for you, a love I will still hold even after I leave you dead on this floor. Hearing her son, Jessica marveled at the awareness in him, the penetrating insight of his intelligence. My father had an instinct for his friends, Paul said. He gave his love sparingly, but with never an error. His weakness lay in misunderstanding hatred. He thought anyone who hated Harkonnens could not betray him. He glanced at his mother. She knows this. I've given her my father's message that he never distrusted her. But Jessica felt herself losing control, bit at her lower lip. Seeing the stiff formality in Paul, she realized what these words were costing him. She wanted to run to him, cradle his head against her breast as she never had done. But the arm against her throat had ceased its trembling. The knife pointed her back, pressed still and sharp. One of the most terrible moments in a boy's life, Paul said, is when he discovers his father and mother are human beings who share a love that he can never quite taste. It's a loss, an awakening to the fact that the world is there and here, and we are in it alone. The moment carries its own truth. You can't evade it. I heard my father when he spoke of my mother. She's not the betrayer, Gurney. Jessica found her voice, said, Gurney, release me. There was no special command in the words, no trick to play on his weaknesses, but Gurney's hand fell away. She crossed to Paul, stood in front of him, not touching him. Paul, she said, there are other awakenings in this universe. I suddenly see how I've used you and twisted you and manipulated you to set you on a course of my choosing, a course I had to choose, if that's any excuse, because of my own training. She swallowed past a lump in her throat, looked up into her son's eyes. Paul, I want you to do something for me. Choose the course of your happiness. Your desert woman. Marry her if that's your wish. Defy everyone and everything to do this, but choose your own course. She broke off, stopped by the low sound of muttering behind her. Gurney. She saw Paul's eyes directed beyond her, turned. Gurney stood in the same spot, but had sheathed his knife, pulled the robe away from his breast to expose the sleek greyness of an issue stillsuit, the type the smugglers traded for among the siege warrens. "Put your knife right here in my breast," Gurney muttered. "I say kill me and have done with it. I have besmirched my name. I have betrayed my own duke, the finest—" "Be still," Paul said. Gurney stared at him. "Close that robe and stop acting like a fool," Paul said. "I've had enough foolishness for one day." "Kill me, I say," Gurney raged. "You know me better than that," Paul said. "How many kinds of an idiot do you think I am? Must I go through this with every man I need?" Gurney looked at Jessica, spoke in a forlorn, pleading note, so unlike him. "For you, my lady, please. You kill me." Jessica crossed to him, put her hands on his shoulders. "Gurney, why do you insist the Atreides must kill those they love?" Gently she pulled the spread robe out of his fingers, closed and fastened the fabric over his chest. Gurney spoke brokenly. "But you thought you were doing a thing for Leto," she said, "and for this I honour you." "My lady," Gurney said. He dropped his chin to his chest, squeezed his eyelids closed against the tears. "Let us think of this as a misunderstanding among old friends," she said, and Paul heard the soothers, the adjusting tones in her voice. "It's over and we can be thankful we'll never again have that sort of misunderstanding between us." Gurney opened eyes bright with moisture, looked down at her. "The Gurney Halleck I knew was a man adept with both blade and balisette," Jessica said. "It was the man of the balisette I most admired. Doesn't that Gurney Halleck remember how I used to enjoy listening by the hour while he played for me? Do you still have a balisette, Gurney?" "I have a new one," Gurney said. "Brought from Chosok. A sweet instrument. Plays like a genuine Varota, though there's no signature on it. I think myself it was made by a student of Varota's who—" He broke off. "What can I say to you, my lady? Here we prattle about—" "Not prattle, Gurney," Paul said. He crossed to stand beside his mother, eye to eye with Gurney. "Not prattle, but a thing that brings happiness between friends. I'd take it a kindness if you'd play for her now. Battle planning can wait a little while. We'll not be going into the fight till tomorrow at any rate. I'll get my balisette," Gurney said. "It's in the passage." He stepped around them and through the hangings. Paul put a hand on his mother's arm, found that she was trembling. "It's over, mother," he said. Without turning her head, she looked up at him from the corners of her eyes. "Over? Of course. Gurney? Oh, yes." She lowered her gaze. The hangings rustled as Gurney returned to his balisette. He began tuning it, avoiding their eyes. The hangings on the walls dulled the echoes, making the instrument sound small and intimate. Paul led his mother to a cushion, seated her there with her back to the thick draperies of the wall. He was suddenly struck by how old she seemed to him with the beginnings of desert-dried lines in her face, the stretching at the corners of her blue-veiled eyes. "She's tired," he thought. "He must find some way to ease her burdens." Gurney strummed a chord. Paul glanced at him, said, "I've things that need my attention. Wait here for me." Gurney nodded. His mind seemed far away, as though he dwelled for this moment beneath the open skies of Caladan, with cloud fleece on the horizon promising rain. Paul forced himself to turn away, let himself out through the heavy hangings on over the side passage. He heard Gurney take up a tune behind him, and paused a moment outside the room to listen to the muted music. "Orchards and vineyards and full-breasted houris and a cup overflowing before me. Why do I babble of battles and mountains reduced to dust? Why do I feel these tears? Heavens stand open and scatter their riches, my hands need but gather their wealth. Why do I think of an ambush and poison in molten cup? Why do I feel my years? Love arms beckon with their naked delights and Eden's promise of ecstasies. Why do I remember the scars, dreams of old transgressions, and why do I sleep with fears?" A robed Fedaykin courier appeared from a corner of the passage ahead of Paul. The man had hood thrown back and fastenings of his stillsuit hanging loose about his neck, proof that he had come just now from the open desert. Paul motioned for him to stop, left the hangings of the door, and moved down the passage to the courier. The man bowed, hands clasped in front of him the way he might greet a reverend mother or Sayadina of the rites. He said, "Muad'Dib, leaders are beginning to arrive for the council. So soon? These are the ones Stilgar sent for earlier when it was fought." He shrugged. "I see." Paul glanced back toward the faint sound of the balisette, thinking of the old song that his mother favoured, an odd stretching of happy tune and sad words. "Stilgar will come here soon with others. Show them where my mother waits." "I will wait here, Muad'Dib," the courier said. "Yes, you do that." Paul pressed past the man toward the depths of the cavern, headed for the place that each such cavern had, a place near its water-holding basin. There would be a small Shai-Hulud in this place, a creature no more than 9 meters long, kept stunted and trapped by surrounding water ditches. The Maker, after emerging from his little Maker vector, avoided water for the poison it was, and the drowning of a Maker was the greatest Fremen's secret because it produced the substance of their union, the water of life, the poison that could only be changed by a Reverend Mother. The decision had come to Paul while he faced the tension of danger to his mother. No line of the future he had ever seen carried that moment of peril from Gurney Halleck. The future, the grey cloud future, with its feeling that the entire universe rolled toward a boiling nexus, hung around him like a phantom world. I must see it, he thought. His body had slowly acquired a certain spice tolerance that made prescient visions fewer and fewer, dimmer and dimmer. The solution appeared obvious to him. I will drown the Maker. We will see now whether I am the Kwisatz Haderach who can survive the test that the Reverend Mothers have survived. And it came to pass in the 3rd year of the Desert War that Paul Muad'Dib lay alone in the cave of birds beneath the Kiswa hangings of an inner cell. And he lay as one dead, caught up in the revelation of the water of life, his being translated beyond the boundaries of time by the poison that gives life. Thus was the prophecy made true that the Lisan al-Gaib might be both dead and alive. Collected Legends of Arrakis by the Princess Irulan. Chani came up out of the Habanya Basin in the pre-dawn darkness, hearing the fox that had brought her from the south go whirring off to a hiding place in the vastness. Around her, the escort kept its distance, fanning out into the rocks of the ridge to probe for dangers, and giving the maid of Muad'Dib, the mother of his firstborn, the thing she had requested, a moment to walk alone. Why did he summon me? She asked herself. He told me before that I must remain in the south with little Leto and Alia. She gathered her robe and leaped lightly up across a barrier rock and onto the climbing path that only the desert trained could recognize in the darkness. Pebbles slivered underfoot, and she danced across them without considering the nimbleness required. The climb was exhilarating, easing the fears that had fermented in her because of her escort's silent withdrawal and the fact that a precious Fopter had been sent for her. She felt the end leaping at the nearness of reunion with Paul Muad'Dib, her Usul. His name might be a battle cry over all the land. Muad'Dib, Muad'Dib, Muad'Dib. But she knew a different man, by a different name, the father of her son, the tender lover. A great figure loomed out of the rocks above her, beckoning for speed. She quickened her pace. Dawn birds already were calling and lifting into the sky. A dim spread of light grew across the eastern horizon. The figure was not one of her own escort. Of aim? She wondered, marking a familiarity of movement and manner. She came up to him, recognized in the growing light the broad, flat features of the Fed Aiken lieutenant, his hood open and mouth filtered, loosely fastened in the way one did sometimes when venturing out onto the desert for only a moment. Hurry, he hissed. Let her down in the secret crevasse into the hidden cave. It will be light soon, he whispered as he held the door seal open for her. The Harkonnens have been making desperation patrols over some of this region. We dare not chance discovery now. They emerged into the narrow side passage entrance to the Cave of Birds. Glow globes came alight. Ovaim pressed past her, said, Follow me, quickly, now. They sped down the passage, through another valve door, another passage, and through hangings into what had been the Sayadina's alcove in the days when this was an overday rest cave. Rugs and cushions now covered the floor. Woven hangings with the red figure of a hawk hid the rock walls. A low field desk at one side was strewn with papers from which lifted the aroma of their spice origin. The Reverend Mother sat alone directly opposite the entrance. She looked up with the inward stare that made the uninitiated tremble. Ovaim pressed palms together, said, I have brought Chani. He bowed, retreated through the hangings, and Jessica thought, How do I tell Chani? How is my grandson? Jessica asked, so as to be the ritual greeting, Chani thought, and her fears returned. Where is Muad'Dib? Why isn't he here to greet me? He is healthy and happy, my mother, Chani said. I left him with Alia in the care of Hara. My mother, Jessica thought. Yes, she has the right to call me that in the formal greeting. She has given me a grandson. I hear a gift of cloth has been sent from Karanua Siege, Jessica said. It is lovely cloth, Chani said. Does Alia send a message? No message, but the siege moves more smoothly now that the people are beginning to accept the miracle of her status. Why does she drag this out so? Chani wondered. Something was so urgent that they sent a Fopter for me. Now we drag through the formalities. You must have some of the new cloth cut into garments for little Leto, Jessica said. Whatever you wish, my mother, Chani said. She lowered her gaze. Is there news of battles? She held her face expressionless that Jessica might not see the betrayal, for this was a question about Paul Muad'Dib. New victories, Jessica said. Rabbana sent cautious overtures about a truce. His messengers have been returned without their water. Rabbana has even lightened the burdens of the people in some of the Sink villages, but he is too late. The people know he does it out of fear of us. Thus it goes as Muad'Dib said, Chani said. She stared at Jessica, trying to keep her fears to herself. I have spoken his name, but she has not responded. One cannot see emotion in that glazed stone she calls a face, but she is too frozen. Why is she so still? What has happened to my Yusul? I wish we were in the south, Jessica said. The oases were so beautiful when we left. Do you not long for the day when the whole land may blossom thus? The land is beautiful, true, Chani said, but there is much grief in it. Grief is the price of victory, Jessica said. Is she preparing me for grief? Chani asked herself. She said, there are so many women without men. There was jealousy when it was learned that I'd been summoned north. I summoned you, Jessica said. Chani felt her heart hammering. She wanted to clap her hands to her ears, fearful of what they might hear. Still she kept her voice even. The message was signed Muad'Dib. I signed it thus in the presence of his lieutenants, Jessica said. It was a subterfuge of necessity. And Jessica thought, this is a brave woman, my Pauls. She holds to the niceties even when fear is almost overwhelming her. Yes, she may be the one we need now. Only the slightest tone of resignation crept into Chani's voice, and she said, now you may say the thing that must be said. You were needed here to help me revive Paul, Jessica said, and she thought, there, I said it in the precisely correct way, revive. Thus she knows Paul is alive and knows there is peril, all in the same word. Chani took only a moment to calm herself. Then, what is it I may do? She wanted to leap at Jessica, shake her and scream, take me to him, but she waited silently for the answer. I suspect, Jessica said, that the Harkonnens have managed to send an agent among us to poison Paul. It's the only explanation that seems to fit. A most unusual poison. I've examined his blood in the most subtle ways without detecting it. Chani thrust herself forward onto her knees. Poison? Is he in pain? Could I? He is unconscious, Jessica said. The processes of his life are so low that they can be detected only with the most refined techniques. I shudder to think what could have happened had I not been the one to discover him. He appears dead to the untrained eye. You have reasons other than courtesy for summoning me, Chani said. I know you, Reverend Mother. What is it you think I may do that you cannot? She is brave, lovely, and so perceptive, Jessica thought. She'd have made a fine Bene Gesserit. Chani, Jessica said, you may find this difficult to believe, but I do not know precisely why I sent for you. It was an instinct, a basic intuition. The thought came unbidden. Send for Chani. For the first time, Chani saw the sadness in Jessica's expression, the unveiled pain modifying the inward stare. I've done all I know to do, Jessica said. That all. It is so far beyond what is usually supposed as all that you would find difficulty imagining it. Yet, I failed. The old companion Halleck, Chani asked. Is it possible he's a traitor? Not Gurney, Jessica said. The two words carried an entire conversation, and Chani saw the searching, the tests, the memories of old failures that went into this flat denial. Chani rocked back onto her feet, stood up, smoothed her desert-stained robe. Take me to him, she said. Jessica arose, turned through hangings on the left wall. Chani followed, found herself in what had been a storeroom, in rock walls concealed now beneath heavy draperies. Paul lay on a field pad against the far wall. A single glow globe above him illuminated his face. A black robe covered him to the chest, leaving his arms outside it stretched along his sides. He appeared to be unclothed under the robe. The skin exposed, looked waxen, rigid. There was no visible movement to him. Chani suppressed her desire to dash forward, throw herself across him. She found her thoughts instead going to her son, Leto, and she realized in this instant that Jessica once had faced such a moment. Her man, threatened by death, forced in her own mind to consider what might be done to save her young son. The realization formed a sudden bond with the older woman so that Chani reached out and clasped Jessica's hand. The answering grip was painful in its intensity. He lives, Jessica said. I assure you he lives. But the threat of his life is so thin it could easily escape detection. There are some among the leaders already muttering that the mother speaks and not the Reverend Mother, that my son is truly dead and I do not want to give up his water to the tribe. How long has he been this way? Chani asked. She disengaged her hand from Jessica's, moved farther into the room. 3 weeks, Jessica said. I spent almost a week trying to revive him. There were meetings, arguments, investigations. Then I sent for you. The Fedaykin obey my orders, else I might not have been able to delay her. She wet her lips of her tongue, watching Chani cross to Paul. Chani stood over him now, looking down on the soft beard of youth that framed his face, tracing with her eyes the high brow line, the strong nose, the shuttered eyes, the features so peaceful in this rigid repose. How does he take nourishment? Chani asked. The demands of his flesh are so slight he does not yet need food, Jessica said. How many know of what has happened? Chani asked. Only his closest advisors, a few of the leaders, the Fedaykin, and, of course, whoever administered the poison. There is no clue to the poisoner, and it's not for want of investigating, Jessica said. What do the Fedaykin say? Chani asked. They believe Paul is in a sacred trance, gathering his holy powers before the final battles. This is a thought I've cultivated. Chani lowered herself to her knees beside the pad, bent close to Paul's face. She sensed an immediate difference in the air about his face, but it was only the spice, the ubiquitous spice whose odour permeated everything in Fremen life. Still, you were not born to the spice as we were, Chani said. Have you investigated the possibility that his body has rebelled against too much spice in his diet? Allergy reactions are all negative, Jessica said. She closed her eyes, as much to blot out this scene as because of sudden realization of fatigue. How long have I been without sleep? She asked herself. Too long. When you change the water of life, Chani said, you do it within yourself by the inward awareness. Have you used this awareness to test his blood? Normal Fremen blood, Jessica said, completely adapted to the diet and the life here. Chani sat back on her heels, submerging her fears in thought as she studied Paul's face. This is a trick she had learned from watching the Reverend Mothers. Time could be made to serve the mind. One concentrated the entire attention. Presently, Chani said, is there a Maker here? There are several, Jessica said with a touch of weariness. We are never without them these days. Each victory requires its blessing, each ceremony before a raid, but Paul Muad'Dib has held himself aloof from these ceremonies, Chani said. Jessica nodded to herself, remembering her son's ambivalent feelings toward the spice drug and the prescient awareness it precipitated. How did you know this? Jessica asked. It is spoken. Too much is spoken, Jessica said bitterly. Get me the raw water of the Maker, Chani said. Jessica stiffened at the tone of command in Chani's voice, then observed the intense concentration in the younger woman and said, at once. She went out through the hanging descended waterman. Chani sat staring at Paul. If he has tried to do this, she thought, and it's the sort of thing he might try. Jessica knelt beside Chani, holding out a plain Campua. The charged odour of the poison was sharp in Chani's nostrils. She dipped a finger in the fluid, held the finger close to Paul's nose. The skin along the bridge of his nose wrinkled slightly. Slowly, the nostrils flared. Jessica gasped. Chani touched the dampened finger to Paul's upper lip. He drew in a long, sobbing breath. What is this? Jessica demanded. Be still, Chani said. You must convert a small amount of the sacred water. Quickly. Without questioning, because she recognized the tone of awareness in Chani's voice, Jessica lifted the ewer to her mouth, drew in a small sip. Paul's eyes flew open. He stared upward at Chani. It is not necessary for her to change the water, he said. His voice was weak, but steady. Jessica, a sip of the fluid on her tongue, found her body rallying, converting the poison almost automatically. In the light elevation the ceremony always imparted, she sensed a life glow from Paul, a radiation there registering on her senses. In that instant, she knew. You drank the sacred water, she blurted. 1 drop of it, Paul said. So small. 1 drop. How could you do such a foolish thing? She demanded. He is your son, Chani said. Jessica glared at her. A rare smile, warm and full of understanding, touched Paul's lips. Here, my beloved, he said. Listen to her, mother. She knows. A thing that others can do, he must do. Chani said. When I had the drop in my mouth, when I felt it and smelled it, when I knew what it was doing to me, then I knew I could do the thing that you have done, he said. Your B'nai Gesserit proctors speak of the Kwisatz Haderach, but they cannot begin to guess the many places I have been. In the few minutes He broke off, looking at Chani with a puzzled frown. Chani, how did you get here? You're supposed to be... Why are you here? He tried to push himself onto his elbows. Chani pressed him back gently. Please, my Yusul, she said. I feel so weak, he said. His gaze darted around the room. How long have I been here? You've been 3 weeks in a coma so deep that the spark of life seemed to have fled, Jessica said. But it was... I took it just a moment ago, and a moment for you, 3 weeks of fear for me, Jessica said. It was only 1 drop, but I converted it, Paul said. I changed the water of life. And before Chani or Jessica could stop him, he dipped his hand into the ewer they had placed on the floor beside him, and he brought the dipping hand to his mouth, swallowed the palm-cupped liquid. Paul, Jessica screamed. He grabbed her hand, faced her with a death's head grin, and he sent his awareness surging over her. The rapport was not as tender, not as sharing, not as encompassing as it had been with Aliel and with the old Reverend Mother in the cavern, but it was a rapport, and sense sharing of the entire being. It shook her, weakened her, and she cowered in her mind, fearful of him. Aloud she said, You speak of a place where you cannot enter? This place which the Reverend Mother cannot face? Show it to me. She shook her head, terrified by the very thought. Show it to me, he commanded. No, but she could not escape him. Bludgeoned by the terrible force of him, she closed her eyes and focused inward, the direction that is dark. Paul's consciousness flowed through and around her and into the darkness. She glimpsed the place dimly before her mind blanked itself away from the terror. Without knowing why, her whole being trembled at what she had seen. A region where a wind blew and sparks glared, where rings of light expanded and contracted, where rows of tumescent white shapes flowed over and under and around the lights, driven by darkness and a wind out of nowhere. Presently she opened her eyes, saw Paul staring up at her. He still held her hand, but the terrible rapport was gone. She quieted her trembling. Paul released her hand. It was as though some crutch had been removed. She staggered up and back, would have fallen had not Chani jumped to support her. "Reverend Mother," Chani said. "What is wrong?" "Tired," Jessica whispered. "So tired." "Here," Chani said. "Sit here." She helped Jessica to a cushion against the wall. The strong young arms felt so good to Jessica. She clung to Chani. "He has, in truth, seen the water of life?" Chani asked. She disengaged herself from Jessica's grip. "He has seen," Jessica whispered. Her mind still rolled and surged from the contact. It was like stepping to solid land after weeks on the heaving sea. She sensed the old Reverend Mother within her, and all the others awakened and questioning. What was that? What happened? Where was that place? Though it all threaded the realization that her son was the Kwisatz Haderach, the one who could be many places at once. It was the fact out of the Bene Gesserit dream, and the fact gave her no peace. "What happened?" Chani demanded. Jessica shook her head. Paul said, "There is in each of us an ancient force that takes and an ancient force that gives. A man finds little difficulty facing that place within himself where the taking force dwells, but it's almost impossible for him to see into the giving force without changing into something other than man. For a woman, the situation is reversed." Jessica looked up, found Chani was staring at her while listening to Paul. "Do you understand me, Mother?" Paul asked. She could only nod. "These things are so ancient within us," Paul said, "that they're ground into each separate cell of our bodies. We're shaped by such forces. You can say to yourself, 'Yes, I see how such a thing may be.' But when you look inward and confront the raw force of your own life unshielded, you see your peril. You see that this could overwhelm you. The greatest peril to the giver is the force that takes. The greatest peril to the taker is the force that gives. It's as easy to be overwhelmed by giving as by taking." "And you, my son," Jessica asked, "are you the one who gives or the one who takes?" "I am the fulcrum," he said. "I cannot give without taking, and I cannot take without—" He broke off, looking to the wall at his right. Chani felt a draft against her cheek, turned to see the hangings close. "It was of aim," Paul said. He was listening. Except in the words, Chani was touched by some of the prescience that haunted Paul, and she knew a thing yet to be, as though it already had occurred. Of aim would speak of what he had seen and heard. Others would spread the story until it was a fire over the land. "Paul Muad'Dib is not as other men," they would say. "There can be no more doubt. He is a man, yet he sees through to the water of life in the way of a Reverend Mother. He is indeed the Lisan al-Gaib." "You have seen the future, Paul," Jessica said. "Will you say what you've seen?" "Not the future," he said. "I've seen the now." He forced himself to a sitting position, waved Chani aside as she moved to help him. "The space above Arrakis is filled with the ships of the Guild." Jessica trembled at the certainty in his voice. "The Padishah Emperor himself is there," Paul said. He looked at the rock ceiling of his cell, with his favourite Truthsayer and 5 legions of Sardaukar. The old Baron Vladimir Harkonnen is there, with Futha Hawat beside him, and 7 ships jammed with every conscript he could muster. Every great house has its raiders above us, waiting. Chani shook her head, unable to look away from Paul. His strangeness, the flat tone of voice, the way he looked through her, filled her with awe. Jessica tried to swallow in a dry throat, said, "For what are they waiting?" Paul looked at her. "For the Guild's permission to land. The Guild will strand on Arrakis any force that lands without permission." "The Guild's protecting us?" Jessica asked. "Protecting us. The Guild itself caused this by spreading tales about what we do here and by reducing troop transport fares to a point where even the poorest houses are up there now waiting to loot us." Jessica noted the lack of bitterness in his tone, wondered at it. She couldn't doubt his words. They had that same intensity she'd seen in him the night he'd revealed the path of the future that had taken them among the Fremen. Paul took a deep breath, said, "Mother, you must change the quantity of the water for us. We need the catalyst. Chani, have a scout force sent out to find a pre-spice mass. If we plant a quantity of the water of life above a pre-spice mass, do you know what will happen?" Jessica weighed his words, suddenly saw through to his meaning. "Paul," she gasped. "The water of death," he said. "It would be a chain reaction." He pointed to the floor, spreading death among the little makers, killing a vector of the life cycle that includes the spice and the makers. Arrakis will become a true desolation, without spice or maker. Chani put a hand to her mouth, shocked and numb silence by the blasphemy pouring from Paul's lips. "He who can destroy a thing has the real control of it," Paul said. "We can destroy the spice. What stays the Guild's hand?" Jessica whispered. "They're searching for me," Paul said. "Think of that." the finest guild navigators, men who can quest ahead through time to find the safest course for the fastest highliners, all of them seeking me, and unable to find me. How they tremble. They know I have their secret here. Paul held out his cupped hand. Without the spice, they're blind. Chani found her voice. You said you see the now. Paul lay back, searching the spread-out present, its limits extended into the future and into the past, holding on to the awareness of difficulty as the spice illumination began to fade. Go do as I commanded, he said. The future's becoming as muddled for the guild as it is for me. The lines of vision are narrowing. Everything focuses here where the spice is, where they've dared not interfere before, because to interfere was to lose what they must have. But now they're desperate. All paths lead into darkness.